I hate Sony's Spider-Man universe. Wait, that's not what I hate that I like Sony's Spider-Man universe. Because the thing is, I shouldn't. Not because of guilty pleasures or whatever, but because it goes against all rational thoughts I have about this series of movies. These films are the breathing example of everything wrong with Sony's handling of the Spider-Man IP over the course of the past 20 or so years, with somehow as many cancelled projects as one that have seen the light of day, topped off with purposeful false advertising, some of the most insane ADR, and a problem that rots all of these movies to their very core. Man. Contrary to popular belief, Sony's need to expand Spider-Man into its own self-sufficient franchise has been an issue well before The Amazing Spider-Man 2. A lot of people didn't realize that the studio had a Venom spin-off as well as 2 additional Spider-Man sequels in the pipeline during the creation of the cancelled Spider-Man 4. And to put my speculation cap on, which I'll be wearing a lot in this video, I think it's this direction as well as the issues with Spider-Man 3 that led Raimi to quit Spider-Man 4, especially since this is an issue that has plagued every single on-screen incarnation of the character since, I shit you not. This incessant need to expand is in some ways good. Without it, we wouldn't have the Spider-Verse duology or No Way Home. But as you'll come to learn with this damn company is that whenever something good happens with Spider-Man, Sony finds a way to fuck it up. And somehow, against all odds, this studio and their constant ridiculous business endeavors have somehow been failing upwards since 2018. Despite financial flops and a clear lack of direction, these movies have been successful, and have even crossed over into the main MCU long before other, more well-deserved legacy Marvel franchises did. I initially wanted to make this video after the release of Venom 3 and Kraven this year, but 1, this video would just end up being 2 hours long then, and 2, I feel as though my conclusions on this universe will not change regardless of how those movies might end up being. You'll see what I mean. But first, it's not a video essay or whatever the fuck you want to call it if I don't have a lore dump, so here's the quickest explanation I can give for the Sony and Marvel copyright deal. Stick around. This is very pertinent information. It will be on the pop quiz. So, in the 90s, Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy, and to prevent completely having to close their doors, the company sold many of its characters' movie rights to different distributors on the basis that a film had to be made every few years in order to keep said deal intact. Although the number of years varied from studio to studio, in the end, Fox got X-Men, Daredevil, and the Fantastic Four, Universal got Hulk, I think New Line Cinema got Blade, and Sony got Spider-Man. There were a few other distributors who had the rights at one point in other failed film projects, but we really don't need to focus on that right now. Over the next 15-ish years, many of these studios would eventually stop making movies with their characters for various reasons, automatically reverting the rights back to Marvel after a certain amount of time, who, by 2009, was already knee-deep in the MCU. That is, except for Fox and Sony. But this movie isn't about Fox, so we're just gonna focus on the Sony part. From 2002 to 2007, an installment of the Raimi trilogy was released every couple years to insane returns, which is most likely why Sony got comfortable and began planning for multiple sequels after the success of Spider-Man 3. So once 4 was completely cancelled, a reboot had to take its place lest they lost the rights. Hence why The Amazing Spider-Man was announced immediately once Spider-Man 4 was cancelled. I promise you, every business decision that Sony has made regarding Spider-Man makes sense with this stipulation in mind. It's why Spider-Man 4 seemed to be on a somewhat tight schedule, why the TASM films even existed. I may love them with all my heart, but those movies were only made for money. And why Sony rushed a new Spider-Man into the MCU despite Civil War releasing only 2 years after The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and also Andrew Garfield almost allegedly cameoed in the first Avengers movie, but that fell apart. Everybody knows that, but I figured I'd at least mention it here. Now, this recent deal between Sony and Disney for Civil War was both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that Spider-Man was now finally a part of the biggest superhero franchise in the world and could cross over with other Marvel characters. Plus, Kevin Feige, the real Marvel Jesus, would be assisting in the production of the solo films as well. Sure, Disney took all the money from merchandising and had a pretty decent cut of the box office gross, but this deal would legitimize their solo films in a way that was impossible since the Raimi trilogy. And the curse? Well, that'll come later. For now, all you need to worry your little head about is that months before Spider-Man Homecoming would release in theaters, Sony announced that they had revived that Venom spin-off movie and would release it as a part of their new SPUMC universe. They really want to call it the SSU, but SPUMC is way funnier, so sorry. So let's take a quick look at it. Released in 2018, it's I got that Venom. This is the Venom review part. I'm gonna be as quick as I can. Now, I have not rewatched Venom since right before the release of Let There Be Carnage in 2021, and after finally doing so, I can definitely say that my opinion has turned for the worse in that time. I honestly used to adore this movie, and now it's just kind of fine. With hindsight, I think that my first few viewings were impeded by, 1, the shock that Venom actually got his own movie, and 2, which is the criticism that most people levy against this, it feels like it was scrapped in 2003 and somehow finally made its way to be released in theaters 15 years later. In more ways than one, this feels like one of the earlier Marvel movies like X-Men or The First Blade. Half of the movie is set up for the origin, not just the origin, but set up for the origin. There's entire scenes that are dedicated to lazy dialogue, simply meant to explain what a symbiote is. Like Infinity War didn't release just months earlier, like we know what comic book movies are, man. Even the ridiculous song by Eminem that I'm still glad is being bullied to this day. This movie went through a revolving door of writers and directors before finally landing on Ruben Fleischer in the director's chair, along with 3 different screenwriters. It's a little bit concerning, but credit to one of the writers, Kelly Marcel, for not only writing Venom 2, but becoming the writer-director for The Last Dance. That's pretty cool. Ruben Fleischer is, at the very least, good at making comedies, but I don't feel like that's really used to this movie's advantage whatsoever. There's a lot less jokes here than I originally remembered. It often goes for a more serious tone with occasional jokes sprinkled in, which, again, fits with the scrapped movie from 2003 analogy. I'm not saying that it needed to be Deadpool or anything, but it just makes certain scenes like the restaurant lobster massacre come a bit more out of left field. Venom very well could have went for the horror comedy angle, which sounds like what you'd want to do with the character being adapted by the director of Zombieland. And while there is very light body horror and attempts at jump scares, I guess, the film is edited in a way that nothing is ever able to really sit and simmer, which is going to become a very ongoing problem here. So the attempted horror gets lost really fast. This shit makes Spider-Man 2 look like it was rated R. I was not exaggerating when I said most of this movie is origin setup, since it's an hour until the first view of Venom on screen. It's not that the first half of the movie without him is entirely bad. I have seen tons of pointless criticisms made towards this movie, like, I explicitly remember this scene where Riz Ahmed's character, Carlton Drake, a paper-thin, evil CEO caricature, is speaking to this girl who wants to ask a question, but then she ends up getting shushed by a classmate. I remember this scene actually being called out online in videos a lot, because the girl never got to ask her question, like it was a flaw with the movie. But that's the point of the scene. Carlton is an asshole. He's an ego-driven dickhead who used this girl's bullying as a moment to morally grandstand above a rude child. That's fine. The relationship stuff with Anne is fine. I do like that her new boyfriend Dan is a legitimately good guy, and the 3 of them become a weird sort of friendly trio halfway through this movie. Eddie's constant interactions with random side characters in scenes in the city somewhat captured an affinity for San Francisco that the previous Spider-Man incarnation in the 2010s had almost entirely lacked. The cast is great, Mrs. Chen is my favorite. Riz Ahmed is amazing in everything, even when he's completely underutilized. Michelle Williams has really good comedic timing and ends up being one of my favorite parts in this and the sequel. But man, Tom Hardy deserves all his flowers. Not only for playing dual roles as both Eddie and Venom, but for also completely going for it when the movie calls for it. Need I mention the lobster scene again? But yeah man, that's about all I like. The first 30 minutes is Eddie rooting his life in a way that's so uninteresting. The next 30 minutes is Eddie wondering what's happening to him after the symbiote bonds to him, up until the hour mark where Venom makes his first appearance. And from there until the credits, it's a lot closer to what I expected from a Venom solo movie, but it's still not quite there. The banter's playful, most of the action scenes are pretty fun, but it's still pretty rough. The worst part of the movie is the final fight between Venom and Riot, this symbiote who has 2 minutes of screen time and no personality whatsoever. The fight just ends up being a big, mushy CGI mess, with characters that are colored black and fucking gray against the night sky. You'd think with a movie focused on symbiotes switching from host to host, that the final fight would involve some sort of creativity, like Carlton and Eddie switching symbiotes, or Carlton switching between different symbiotes, just anything other than what the fuck I'm looking at right now. The final scene between Eddie and Anne, where Venom promises to get her back, is a little weird. It seems like the movie was pretty unsure on whether to keep Anne and Dan together or to have her and Eddie be endgame, and ends up in this weird middle area where Eddie just comes off like a fucking creep. And this is a story thread that I'm still not sure will have any meaningful conclusion, and I just hope it's cut from Venom 3, man. And then there's a lot of little things that kind of get to me. Visually, this movie bothers me so fucking much. There's this weird motion smoothing baked into some of the shots, especially some interior ones. Like the shutter speed wasn't synced with the different cameras used on set or something. It's just so weird. The line "have a nice life" is said to Eddie twice by both Carlton Drake and his boss in back-to-back scenes. I initially thought that this was some sort of link showing that the two were working together, or at the very least, Eddie's job was in Carlton's back pocket. But Eddie's boss completely disappears from the movie after this. They talk about him off screen like they couldn't get Cephas Jones back for another day, and it's just like, what? Cut that fucking part out! Lots of the dialogue feels oddly chopped or cut off, like there's no space, which is weird since both of the editors that worked on Venom have earned awards for their work, and deservedly so. But there's something about this first Venom movie that I can't quite put my finger on it. It feels chopped and screwed, and not in the traditional sense. It comes off like something's missing, which compounds into this weird feeling I get whenever watching it. I was unfortunately one of those people who believed that Venom was a rated R film that was trimmed down to PG-13. To be fair, I was 17. I knew ADR was a thing, and I'd heard it used in movies before, but not to the extent that it's used in Venom. Madam Web got a lot of shit for its ADR, deservedly so, but I think we forgot how fucking weird Tom Hardy sounds here solely due to the editing and the ADR. My least favorite line in this movie is where Eddie thinks Venom is dying at the very end and he just yells, "Venom, no!" And I hate it so fucking much. Again, this is a fine movie. I had an alright time rewatching it now, especially for something that was in development hell for 11 years. But it somehow manages to feel weirdly corporate for a superhero movie that had absolutely no merchandise. And to be honest, I think that it has to do with the way that Sony dealt with the marketing. There's two things about the release of Venom that has rubbed me the wrong way in the years since it's come out. The purpose of the ADR and the curse. Ooh. We should have known from Sony immediately changing the way that Doris Skirth pronounces the word symbiotes in the final movie.
We call them symbiotes. Between human and symbiote, we call them symbiotes.
Symbiotes?
That Sony was going to be a lot more reactive to fan outcries than ever before. It's not a coincidence that fans had made a hoopla about the pronunciation in the reveal trailer, referring to them as symbiotes, only for all the references and uses of the term symbiote to be ADR'd in shots where we can't see the characters' mouths. Honestly, this is not really a big issue. This is pre-Sonic movie but post-Deadpool. It was the beginning stages of movie studios attempting to use social media almost like a focus group for something so fucking minute. But then, there's the curse. Or what I like to call the Tom Holland problem, which is a Sony variant of the Trolley problem. You almost had to be there to see it, but for a long time, Sony was terrified to pull the lever on whether or not the Spider-Man in their universe was Tom Holland. In a lot of the press for Venom, both producers Amy Pascal and Kevin Feige, as well as Ruben Fleischer, would all give variations of "we'll see" or I don't know, when bringing up the idea of these versions of Peter and Eddie eventually meeting. It took John Watts, the director of Spider-Man Homecoming, to outright say that Venom was, quote, "not in the Marvel world," end quote, in 2017, an entire year before Venom's release. But that didn't really clear anything up, nor did it stop the non-answers from Sony, and it honestly feels like the movie was made to explicitly build upon this uncertainty. Venom is set in San Francisco, which, to be fair, is accurate to his solo series Lethal Protector. But in one of the first scenes, Eddie said he was, quote, "run out of New York," a reference to his comic book origin that, long story short, involves Peter Parker. But Peter is still in high school in Homecoming, so his origin story for this universe involving Sin Eater would probably have to be changed for the movies if they were in the same universe. John Jameson, J. Jonah Jameson's son, shows up in the opening, and I think that the Daily Bugle was mentioned, but that's about it in terms of direct Spider-Man connections. So, to the average moviegoer, or person who doesn't spend a bunch of time reading articles and documents like I do, this and Tom Holland's Spider-Man being in the same universes makes sense. Mind you, this is October of 2018, only a couple months before audiences would be introduced to the multiverse and Into the Spider-Verse. This sort of non-answer, headcanon shit isn't uncommon for studios to do. Paramount's been doing the same thing with the new Transformers movie since 2018, with directors and producers being on completely different pages on whether or not the recent installments are in the same timeline as the Michael Bay films. The only difference is that those movies have always had inconsistencies and retcons, and the new films, outside of omitting Megatron, aren't really adhering to what's come before, so much so that it harms the final film. Something that I really can't say for Sony's Marvel movies. You'll understand. Damn, this is a big video. So why is this set in a separate universe? Well, it probably has to do with Marvel not wanting to do any more with Sony than was required, like passive-aggressive co-parenting. The deal that they had at the time, as well as their new deal that they renegotiated on, explicitly states that Tom Holland can only be in a certain amount of A, solo movies made by Sony, as well as B, team-up movies made by Marvel. The contract isn't public knowledge as far as I know, so all the details are pretty slim to none. But what we do know is that after the renegotiation in 2019, Holland had one more solo movie, which eventually became No Way Home, as well as one more team-up movie, which is most likely going to be Secret Wars. And neither of the studios could touch his variation of Spider-Man outside of that, unless another deal is written up. And apparently, the same goes for the characters that Sony uses in their films, which is a very recent discovery. Allegedly, if Sony makes a movie about a villain in their solo universe, a variation of that character cannot be used in the MCU. Gee, I hope this alternate universe stuff doesn't cause major problems down the line.
Knock, knock, let the devil in, malevolent as I've ever been, head is spinning, this medicine screaming.
I was sure that there was some sort of buffer between the two Venom sequels, like a Lost spin-off made in 2019 or something that we just don't talk about anymore, but that's probably because of all the other Spider-Man stuff that we got from 2018 to 2021. So after Venom 1, there was a bunch of stuff put into pre-production, like a spin-off show about Silk with Tiffany Espenson reprising her role as Cindy Moon from Spider-Man Homecoming. How does that make sense if they're in alternate universes? Don't ask. Don't forget Silver and Black, which became a TV show, then a movie, then a TV show, then a movie, then was just canceled altogether. There's also Jackpot and an El Muerto movie with Bad Bunny. Both are also canceled, but the first follow-up to actually be released would be Venom 2. Which makes sense since the first one made like 80 million on its opening weekend and went on to make a total of 850 million collectively, and it had a tease for Woody Harrelson as Carnage in a just terrible fucking wig. So in 2021, right before the release of No Way Home, Sony released Let There Be Carnage. And when I watched it, I hated it. And to be honest, I really don't know what the hell I was on about in 2019. Man, Venom 2 is miles better than the first movie, no pun intended. The opening 30 minutes or so is exactly what I've wanted from this entire universe. Woody Harrelson is a great villain, the side characters get used a lot more here. Granted, this movie pushes it into a straight up comedy from beginning to end. To give credit, it's pretty funny, and it rarely ever stomped over the emotional beats to cram in another quip, which I appreciated. But I was disappointed with how Carnage was used in the movie. Again, I really think that Venom could have been Sony's horror comedy franchise, with the first one being a body horror film as Eddie gets used to the symbiote, and Let There Be Carnage being a slasher with Cletus Cassidy. But it seems like the closest they want to get to that dream is just an October release date. Okay, I guess. The kills are super tame, save for one with Carnage's tongue. I hated that, but lack of horror aside, I still enjoyed the sense of life and palpable style that Andy Serkis brought to this movie. There's more color, the lighting is brighter, there's that animated sequence of Cletus' backstory, probably to refrain from scarring younger children with live-action depictions of familicide. The score has a lot more life to it, which is to be expected from Marco Beltrami, who worked on the score for both of the Wolverine sequels. The biggest complaint against this movie, one that I initially agreed with, was that it separates Eddie and Venom for too much of the runtime. However, not only is it easier to enjoy the relationship arc between the two of them once you know what to expect, but they're only separated for like 30 minutes. Granted, this movie's only an hour and a half, but those 30 minutes managed to integrate more Venom side characters, mainly Detective Mulligan, who's set up to become Toxin by the end. Even the final battle here is kind of good. At least it's the best in the Sonyverse so far. Whenever I think of Venom 2, I immediately think of the set piece. Not only is the cathedral a visually appealing setting, but the final fight uses every part of it. The ground floor, the rafters, the construction outside, even the very top of the church, which gives major 2000 superhero movie vibes. It's pretty good. It also helps that it's easier to tell which symbiote is which with black and red, as opposed to black and a very dark silver. Also, I think Carnage eats the priest and literally says, "Power up." So that's kind of funny. Although this third act didn't need a last-second damsel in distress like half of the other Spider-Man movies, or the direct allusion to the Amazing Spider-Man 2, that just comes off a bit in bad taste. That little tidbit aside, Venom 2 is still the best movie in this universe, and it's not even close. But that's not what this movie is popular for. You might remember, but in 2021, there was a little movie that we were all super excited for called No Way Home. I think people have quickly forgotten that Sony had a triple team up at the movies in winter 2021 up until spring 2022. Venom came out in October, No Way Home in December, and Morbius released just 4 months later on April 1st. Yes, that is its real release date. By this point in October of 2021, it was still somewhat in the air whether or not these were in different universes, only for Venom 2 to finally stop pussyfooting around and directly tie into No Way Home with an after-credit scene of Eddie and Venom being teleported to Earth 616 like the other Sony characters in that movie. Venom recognizes Spider-Man since the symbiotes have a multiversal hive mind. This is comics accurate, and the two set out to find him. Cut to black. And boy, considering Sony's track record so far with this SPUMC, this scene still surprises me considering how fast it all happened, and how not bad it is. Eddie went from a sort of spin-off to having a chance to directly be part of the biggest Spider-Man movie ever, and yet, he does absolutely fucking nothing. No Way Home just completely flies by, and by the end of the movie, Eddie is still at the hotel, now at the bar, trying to have this bartender explain the chronological events of the MCU to him, only to be transported back to his Earth, where The Last Dance will pick up from. He did leave some of the symbiote behind, which is, ooh, Spider-Man 4, but that might be retconned for multiple reasons. Do you see what I mean by blessing and a curse? I legitimately think Marvel only let Sony have this post-credit scene on the grounds that the resolution was a fucking joke, much like the rest of this connected universe. Insults aside, this leaves us back at square one, Spider-Man-less. Now, it's here where I need to backtrack just a little bit. In 2019, Marvel and Sony broke off their deal and went their separate ways temporarily. It seems that their disagreement stemmed from the financing for the second and third solo films, and for a little bit of time, there was possibly going to be a third Tom Holland movie without any of the greater Marvel universe. Obviously, it was eventually resolved, giving us No Way Home as well as another undetermined team-up movie, which will most likely be Secret Wars. But looking back at the language Sony used in their statements, almost implies that Tom Holland would continue playing the character, which makes this whole SPUMC thing make sense. My belief is that SPUMC is not only meant to keep the film rights with Sony or to ride on the coattails of the MCU, but as a backdoor universe for Tom Holland, with enough space that could be a completely different Spider-Man altogether. It would explain Sony's continued insistence that the Toms will meet up any day now, the lack of any superhero representation altogether up till now, as well as the universe seemingly completely steering clear of New York. So for Sony, it doesn't really matter that Venom's 2 post-credit scene has no payoff. What matters is the fans were more excited to see another one of their films, thus perpetually earning them money. And this focus on profiting off of fandom gets no more blatant than I fucking hate Morbius. Like, I loathe this film. This is the only movie I've seen in theaters and regretted every penny. I tend to rewatch movies every now and then, even ones I'm so-so on, or at the very least, watch scenes from movies and go, oh yeah, I remember seeing that. I have never revisited Morbius in any fucking capacity after my initial viewing, and with good reason. No hyperbole, this is the driest, most unimaginative movie I've ever fucking seen, and I am to this day still surprised with how warmly it was received as an ironic masterpiece or some shit, but we'll get to that later. Morbius is just another bland superhero origin movie. It's all about this Dr. Michael who wants to cure this blood disease that him and his best friend Milo has, only to accidentally become a vampire. Then Milo turns himself into a vampire, they fight, Milo dies, the end. It's a very economic movie, only coming in at about an hour and 44 minutes, and I'm pretty sure that the credits take up about 20 minutes of those, so at least that's a positive. The entire script hinges on Milo and Michael's friendship, but there's only a couple scenes setting it up before the big vampire change, so it relies on both characters reminding everyone in their vicinity, and by extension the audience, that they're best friends, almost like brothers. It's funny to me that the entire plot is exactly the same as Harry and Peter from TASM 2, just with even less setup, which is baffling to me. This somehow has a less believable friendship breakup than a movie with 9 different plot threads. Morbius is the closest Sony has ever gotten to a horror-esque Spider-Man movie with an entire slasher sequence on a boat, but it's like legitimately terrible. Not because it lacks blood, but because it's got that SPUMC editing that's so scared of letting a moment sit or showing a death without obscuring it, to the point that it feels like it's not even in the same universe as Venom. The hallway scene about halfway through the movie, set in Horizon Labs, at least had some atmosphere, even if it ends up throwing it away with a dog shit jump scare at the end. But that's about as close as it gets to trying to be anything other than bland superhero schlock. I sort of feel bad about bullying this movie. I'm not mad, just severely disappointed. Like, the score has motifs directly taken from Hans Zimmer's Batman Begins soundtrack. It's not inspired. That's the same fucking thing. That's just stealing. I don't mind the comedic relief of the two detectives trying to stop Morbius. One's a straight man, one's cracking jokes every 2 seconds. They're fine. I think the special effects aren't the worst. I like this weird sort of cloud thing for whenever Morbius and Milo use their powers. The subway sequence is the best part of the movie. It's just a shame that this vampire on vampire action is not most of the runtime. Also, Matt Smith is too good for this movie. I was a Doctor Who fan as a kid. Full disclosure. Doesn't do this movie any favors that Michael Morbius isn't an interesting character either whatsoever, and the script tries to replace any sort of personality with just sarcasm and altruism. Like he's either cracking a joke or just being good because that's what you gotta do, and like that's all that there is to him. The Venom reference in this movie doesn't even make any fucking sense. How does he know Venom's catchphrase? I really do think that Morbius is the most offensive comic book movie I've ever seen, simply because it is so uninterested in its own concept and so uninspired with its execution that if you try to convince me that this is the first movie ever written with AI, I'd fucking believe you. The final fight is set in a construction site at night, and then it goes underground. Both are difficult to see, but from even what I can piece together, it's a fucking snooze fest. Morbius eventually beats Milo by what I can only describe as airbending with bats. Bat bending. I'd like to say that that's cool or like ironic in a funny way, but I was just so mentally gone by that point that I was like, yeah, he's bending bats. Like, how do you make vampires boring? And don't even think about making a Twilight joke in the comments. I see you typing right now. At fucking least, I am engaged with those movies. The only gauge I have when watching Morbius is a 12. None of the side characters do anything. That's not me making a hyperbolic criticism towards a movie. The detectives don't uncover or stop shit. The love interest Martine is just sort of there the whole movie, and she gets turned into a vampire at the very end. You'd think to help Morbius, but no, she just opens her eyes and that's the sequel bait, I guess. Everyone outside of Michael or Milo or their adoptive dad who's fucking dead feel like more setup for a sequel that will undeniably never happen. Speaking of which, the worst part of this movie, hands down, is the tie-in with No Way Home. After the movie abruptly ends with Michael flying into the camera, the sky opens up due to Doctor Strange's spell in No Way Home, and Michael Keaton's Vulture shows up in the Sony universe. I hear a lot of people criticizing modern movies, whether they're comic book or not, for having pauses for reactions, and while yes, this is a thing in films, especially superhero movies nowadays, specifically No Way Home, they usually aren't too noticeable and can easily be written off as our characters being just as surprised as we are. Except in Morbius, once Michael Keaton shows up, the movie goes silent for a distractingly long period of time before he cracks a joke. Cut to black. Had it ended there, I'd be confused and bothered, but that's not all. Because then, Adrian Toomes gets released since he never committed a crime in this universe, somehow makes a vulture suit off-screen, meets with Morbius, says that this has something to do with Spider-Man, and that they should team up. The end. I have never seen a more batshit sequence of events occur. This had to be improv. You can't convince me that this was written on a script. This fails as setup for a sequel, it fails as a tie-in to the MCU Spider-Man movies, and it's just plain bad. Vulture is written wildly out of character, since much like Sandman, the first thing he'd be worried about is his daughter. This breaks the logic of No Way Home, since the reason these characters went into the MCU was because of Doctor Strange's spell in that universe working as a magnet for all Spider-Man characters, and once the spell was fixed, they all went home. This is not how magnets work. I think the implication seems to be that Vulture was sent during the climax when the universes began to fall apart and he somehow fell through the rift. And since Sony's universe is a different branch of the MCU, crossing over won't cause an incursion like in Multiverse of Madness. But this is still stupid. The part that pisses me off the most about this, besides the botched execution of an idea rooted in corporate fan service or the entire thing being shot like a fucking car commercial, is that Morbius just accepts this idea that Spider-Man is the one responsible when he doesn't fucking exist in this universe yet. This is why we're going through these movies chronologically. Eddie Brock was surprised at the idea of a Spider-Man, and yet Morbius is just like, yeah, I guess so. You'd think that's all, but no. What makes this worse is the actively predatory false advertising. Using the Daily Bugle logo and the suit from the Raimi films, the latter of which was just a screenshot of the first Insomniac game for some reason, the graffiti of Murderer implying that this took place after Far From Home where Peter is framed for the murder of Mysterio, as well as a completely different shot cameo for Michael Keaton implying the creation of the Sinister Six. All of those scenes and all those Easter eggs are not in the final movie because it makes no sense. But it never had to, because that's how Sony just needed to get people into seats. This movie was afraid to be campy or legitimately interesting. It cut itself off at an hour and 40 minutes with credits included, and was released on April 1st. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Sony was ashamed of Morbius, so they had to get people into seats by directly tying this into the actual good Spider-Man movies. I was livid leaving the theater, ready to call this one of the worst movies I'd seen in a very long time, only to see people online not only making fun of the movie, but embrace it ironically. Not to sound like the fun police, but there are people on the internet complaining about specific scenes being cut from movies, which is a natural part of post-production for the most part, all the while actual false advertising was being humored, all for the sake of memes. Modern social media marketing is a bit of a hellscape for films and TV. Back in the 2010s, it was very simple. Super Bowl ads, trailers and TV spots every now and then, trailers playing the movies, cast members would go on to late night shows, answer some questions, do an interesting collab or two to also get the word out there for the movie. But now, there's this almost craving to go viral. We see it every day now on apps like TikTok, with brands doing their best to keep up with modern trends and humor, all of which comes off like hello fellow kids. But then there's the event, like with Barbenheimer, a situation I'm still perplexed by. I understand that the whole appeal was that their movie is on the opposite side of the spectrum in more ways than one, but I don't know. I saw Barbie and that was it. That was pretty good. However, the entire joke died for everyone when studios and journalists began to actively get involved, attempting to force a new Barbenheimer. But the thing is, this exact same chain of events happened the year prior with Morbius. The whole "it's Morbin time" became a joke that's been beaten to death and is still being recycled for every new movie since. Morbius Sweep was a joke about how this movie would become the most successful movie of all time, deliberately making fun of how fast ticket sales dropped in its second week of release. Except Sony, doing a Sony, wanted in on the fun. So they had Jared Leto pretend to read a script for Morbius 2, which would have been fine enough. It is a little weird how much they're making fun of their own movie's quality, but the bigger atrocity was that Sony actively misread the room and re-released Morbius in theaters, only for the movie to bomb again. This is the smoking gun of why I think Sony has no clue of what they're doing long term. That the success of Venom 1 and 2 were in spite of their actions as opposed to because of them. If you can't tell, it's here where my haha fun time with these movies have been cut off at the knees. No longer were these the weird cousins of MCU Spider-Man, now they were cash grabs, meant to both prey on the excitement of Spider-Man fans and ride waves of hype that would inevitably come crashing down. I hate Morbius. I hate that it was made into a joke that ran in too long, and I hate that Sony completely misread the room. But I also hate that it showed me that these movies are not all fun and games. And that leads us to what many think is the worst Spider-Man movie ever made. Buckle in, bitches. Released on Valentine's Day of this year, It's hard to explain just how much vitriol this movie got upon release, especially when comparing it to the previous three. It's just a little weird that this was the movie that people suddenly lost their patience with. I chalk it up to a mixture of the perfection that was Across the Spider-Verse releasing the previous summer, and the meme excuse of Morbius quickly wearing off. So Madam Web ended up getting the brunt of complaints that most of these movies have deserved evenly. Yes, its ADR is egregious, there's clearly lots of reshoots and scenes left on the cutting room floor, and this is frankly the movie that has the most missed potential, but it's nowhere near as frustrating as Morbius or as overdone as Venom 1. Yes, this is where I have to put down my pitchfork because I actually kinda like Madam Web. I liked it my first viewing, and yes, even when going into it a second time with a fine-tooth comb, I still enjoyed it this time around. The concept of a Terminator movie with 4 non-powered Spider-Man people going up against one supervillain with only half of Spider-Man's powers in order to protect an unborn Peter Parker is kind of my ideal Spider-Man spin-off. However, of course the execution leaves a lot to be desired, but you know what I'm gonna say already. The story is about Ezekiel Sims, a spider-like villain, even though he wasn't really like that in the comics from what I hear. I never read that run. He gets a premonition of 3 Spider-Women killing him in the future and decides to kill them while they're teenagers, only for Cassandra Webb, who just got her own set of powers, to protect them. Somewhere in there's a young Uncle Ben and an expecting Mary Parker. Now, despite my opening statements, there is a lot wrong with Madam Web. It still takes a bit too long for the movie to get started. The 4 main characters don't meet until 41 minutes in. Some of the dialogue feels a bit too focused on setup that it feels very stilted. Dakota Johnson is a great actress, but some of the more emotional scenes leave a bit to be desired. But the thing I hate the most as a diehard Spider-Man fan is the secret spider tribe in the Peruvian jungle. Both an idea and an execution. It's fucking dumb. Madam Web implies that all of these spider people get their powers from this special secret spider in the Peruvian jungle that are protected by these not Spider-Men. I was bracing myself for their inclusion this time around, and still, for the first 5 minutes, I legitimately believe that this was the worst movie I'd seen of the bunch. This tribe is that bad of an inclusion to Spider-Man lore, it makes no fucking sense. However, the worst part of this movie can wait for a little bit. Let's talk about positives first. I really like the dynamic between the young Spider-Women and Cassandra. The scenes of her and Ben being parental figures to the 3 girls were moments I'd appreciated a lot, especially how the main 4 women become a pseudo-spider family by the end. That was kinda cute. If anything else, it's nice that these more obscure Spider-Man characters were able to get a movie dedicated entirely to themselves. I think the comedy works here a lot more naturally than it did in Venom 1 and Morbius. The anticlimactic wall crawling scene did get me to chuckle on both of my viewings. One of the final jokes of the movie being the implication that Cassandra knows exactly when and how her best friend is going to fucking die is morbid as shit, and I kinda wish that the whole movie was more like that. The suits, for how little screen time they get, are very well made. The cinematography is somewhat lively, at least compared to the previous 3. I just appreciate how much the camera gets to move around here more. This is the most New York a Spider-Man movie has felt since the Raimi trilogy. Now, setting this in 2003, it was a choice, but I do appreciate how there's an attempt to capture the style of that time period. I only wish it was played up a bit more. Show me Cassandra watching TRL or some shit, dude. Unlike Morbius, there are great sequences here, like the diner fight. The only thing preventing them from being more interesting is that the kills are somehow lazier than Venom 2. I think by this point everyone has criticized how Ezekiel just chokes his victims and throws them. And yeah, it's pretty lame. Sometimes there will be a pretty gross kill, like when Ezekiel snaps Julia's neck on a diner chair. That was fucking gnarly. When I saw this in theaters, I think that there was a family with small children behind me. I really hope that they weren't looking at the screen at that point. The final fight is... it's not good. At least it's not as bad as Morbius. Cassandra going blind from a firework feels a bit pedestrian for a superhero movie, and I try to rationalize the useless backflip as a weird reference to the Spider-Man 3 game, which has become oddly relevant to recent Spider-Man lore. Plus, it was not lost on me that Ezekiel is killed by a giant P. Also, the final theme is just read from John Pisano's score for the first Insomniac Spider-Man game. But at least that could be excused as brand synergy, not theft. Alright, fine, I'll talk about the actual worst part of Madam Web. The amount of dialogue that's dubbed over in this movie is fucking insane. Nando V Movies made an entire video on this subject, but basically, half of Ezekiel Sims' lines are completely changed in post, meaning that Tahar Rahim had to go on a microphone in a booth and record all the lines again, and it was fixed in editing, which is weird enough to have to dub over that much of the movie, but mixed alongside the reshoots and delays, it leads me to my speculation on what Madam Web was originally about. From the information that we have, it's clear that, at some point in production, there was a shift from Peter Parker to the 3 Spider-Women being Ezekiel Sims' target, based on both what lines were changed as well as this concept art clearly depicting Tom Holland's Spider-Man fighting Ezekiel Sims. I think that as a part of this change, names that were too identifiable to Spider-Man fans like Ben's new girlfriend May or Mary's son Peter are treated like Voldemort. Like there's this ongoing thing with, oh, what's the baby's name? And you never hear the fucking name throughout the whole movie. But there's more than enough context given for attentive fans to piece together who these characters obviously are. Like, even Richard Parker isn't here for some reason. He's written off as being off on a work trip or something, which could be an excuse to have Ben play a larger role in the movie, but it could also be for people to project that Tom Holland is Peter Parker. It's clear why 2003 was originally picked as the time period with this in mind, if the movie was meant to be the Terminator. Tom Holland's Spider-Man was born in 2001 according to Far From Home, but Sony's not allergic to messing up timelines before. Removing Peter's name altogether and shifting the focus onto the Spider-Women makes Peter's birth in the movie by the end feel incredibly unimportant, when this feels like the big thing these movies have all been building up to. And by extension, this movie makes all of Peter's life feel predetermined by a bunch of random shit, removing all of his own agency and identity. This isn't a case of an alternative take on the character. This is a case of so much backstory that it makes it feel like Peter Parker is the Messiah or something. I really blame all of this on the Spider Tribe. Man, I hate them so much. Like, even the look of his suit is taken from both these guys and Ezekiel Sims? I can't even. In Spunk, Uncle Ven's words are not just the advice of a man to his adopted son that have echoed throughout the multiverse. They're now just plagiarized from some random unnamed spiritual guide. This is all compounded by the director, S.J. Clarkson, in her feature-length debut, shouts out, outright confirming that Madam Web takes place in its own universe, separate from the Venom movies. Much like you, I was in complete fucking shock at this news. This isn't really an offhand comment from an interview that could be misconstrued. This is the director of the movie pointing out that the only confirmation that Peter Parker exists in this universe doesn't even take place in the universe that Sony is building. I can't even make this shit up. It's for this reason that, despite liking it, Madam Web is easily the messiest of the 4 movies. Just from watching it, you can tell that this is being held together by Scotch tape, which is just how it is when making movies sometimes. Look, whether or not Sony intended for Madam Web to be in its own universe is really neither here nor there, mainly since there's been nothing to confirm or debunk this statement since. But what really matters is why this would even be an option. It's 2024, it's been 6 years since Venom 1, and with all the teases, all the behind the scenes speak of a long-term plan, there's nothing to show for it. The universe is still Spider-Man-less by this point, there's no villains because Venom keeps killing him off. Madam Web at least gives some sort of impression of progress. And to explain how Tom Holland Peter and Tom Hardy Venom could possibly meet up post No Way Home. And this is where the speculation comes in. This kind of makes sense considering Madam Web's powers is to see across the multiverse, and she was originally the nexus for every Spider-Man crossover pre-Spider-Verse in the 2010s. So if Madam Web exists, then all of Sony's projects, regardless of universe or continuity, can cross over without the need of a tear in the multiverse or a canon event. But it's mainly just the SPUMC and the MCU. However, since Madam Web bombed and Dakota Johnson seems completely uninterested in returning, whether or not she will be used in that inevitable crossover in the year 2085 is kind of up in the air. Also, this is the first SPUMC movie to be released completely separate from a tentpole Spider-Man movie, and it bombed worse than Morbius, so they are not doubling back to this whatsoever. But all this brings us back to the Tom Holland trolley problem again. This is not only the second film in a row to have neon lights falling in the final fight, but the second one in a row to attempt to directly tie itself into the greater Spider-Man multiverse, only for it to be cut during production. Credit to Madam Web, at least the Spider-Man connections in that were paramount to the story and not just a ruse meant to get ticket sales, but as a result, the removal of Tom's Spider-Man, or any Spider-Man, makes that film not only feel disjointed, but completely pointless in comparison to the other three films. Yes, even Morbius. Because as much as I fucking hate that movie, it's kind of a big deal that Tom Holland's first villain is now in the SPUMC, with Michael Keaton even hit to get some sort of long-term plan he was told about in an interview. Madam Web tries to be a pseudo-alternate past for a Spider-Man, whether it be Tom Holland or not, that would have set up multiple other Spider people, only for the Spider-Man connection to be removed, and the Spider people to be seemingly ignored moving forward. Once again leaving you with this sort of empty feeling during the credits. With the knowledge that this movie could have been more experimental and finally given the Sony films some sort of direction, I enjoy it with this twinge of pain. Mostly anger mixed with confusion as well as limerence for what could have been, like any project that goes through massive changes in production. These movies are products in the weirdest way imaginable. It's not like any other movie where it comes out and at the same time the aisle's full of toys, there's books, jackets, undies, fucking birthday decorations. No. All four of the SPUMC movies have not had any toys, very few t-shirts, merchandise, posters, or general paraphernalia. Outside of a collector's hot toy and some Marvel Legends released years down the line, these movies are the products being sold, right? There have been comic book movies before with no tie-ins. Infamously, due to Disney wanting the rights back, the second wave of the Fox X-Men films and Fan4stick were unable to make any merchandise whatsoever, which is unfortunately a major facet of commercial filmmaking in order to help market the movies to kids, as well as assist in making back a profit. But the X-Men movies were different, right? Like not only do they skew towards a older audience, they weren't riding the coattails of a bigger, more financially lucrative franchise. Going into this video, I didn't think that the SPUMC movies were released close to surrounding Spider-Man movies on purpose, but now it sort of makes sense. Again, I sound crazy, but Venom 1 releases a couple months before Into the Spider-Verse, which introduces the multiverse to a film audience before any other superhero universe. Venom 2 and Morbius directly lead into and follow up No Way Home respectively, and due to delays, Madam Web was released well after Across the Spider-Verse, which has a cameo from Mrs. Chen, further solidifying the VenomVerse as a significant part of the Spider multi-web verse shit. All of these inclusions and references makes these Sony films seem more important and pertinent to your other Spider-Man adventures without any progress happening in this world beyond a handful of people with powers and no villains left. So what now? Well, the current state of the SPUMC is this weird stationary limbo, right? And if you couldn't tell, No Way Home is entirely to blame for this, or more accurately, Sony's response to No Way Home is to blame for this. Thanks to the Sony hack in 2014, we know that back in the TASM days when all the spin-offs began to be greenlit in the first place, the big thing that Sony wanted was a Sinister Six movie, and it's clear that, for a while, that was still their goal for a little bit here. However, I think that the success of No Way Home and its crossover into Venom 2 led Sony down this road of pulling back on their own projects, in order to focus entirely on keeping this window of time open for Tom Hardy and Tom Holland to meet up. Kraven comes out in December, yet another 2 Spider-Man movies releasing way too close to each other, and that live-action Nicolas Cage Spider-Man noir show is filming right now. Fingers crossed that sees the light of day for Nicolas Cage alone. And after seeing both the post-credit scene of No Way Home possibly being retconned, as well as Risa Fonz, known for playing the Lizard in The Amazing Spider-Man, as a major part in both trailers for Venom 3, just makes me feel apathetic at this point. The SSU feels like a meandering mess of a universe, swirling the bowl attempting to make as much cash that can be made before it's flushed with the rest of the failed franchises. In a way, this entire universe has been building up to and setting up this moment of Tom Hardy and Tom Holland. That's been the focus, and it seems like it's almost here now. But I honestly don't think that that's enough to save this series of movies. As I record this, Venom 3 has not released yet. And even if it is all about, I'm going to mention leaks that could potentially contain spoilers, so skip here if you don't want to know about it, in 3, 2, Eddie saving a young Peter Parker and ends with a flash forward with Tom Holland, it would not be able to undo the damage of having 5 movies worth of setup. It's just not. It's interesting to me that the Venom movies have worked the most as standalone movies, especially for casual fans, since they're the most separated from all of this nonsense, and yet they're the one character getting constant pushes for a team-up by Sony, despite the other 2 movies getting the closest to having Spider-Man actually in their films. So despite my nature speaking about them, Sony is not incompetent, right? I actually think that they're too good at making business decisions regarding Spider-Man. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was not canceled because it made no money. It made a lot of money. It was canceled because of bad reviews. And because Andrew Garfield didn't show up to a dinner with the CEO, aka the guy that said, "Ridge Racer!"
Remember that one?
It's weird that nobody talks about that part. However, their business model with their films post Spider-Man 3 has been built entirely upon looking ahead at the end goal of about 10 years worth of work with absolutely no idea of how to get there. As if making movies is a walk in the park. Which is undeniably why they've ended up where they are now. My issue with the SPUMC films is not that they're made to tie into the MCU movies, but that they're made with such a lack of care. Not from the cast and crew themselves, but the way Sony treats them as disposable fodder is simply meant to kick a Spider-Man shaped can down the road. The tight editing meant to make these movies as short as humanly possible, greenlighting as many projects as they can and trying their best to connect it to Tom Holland at first, but then to any other Spider-Man that they can, until they eventually realized that wasn't a good idea either. It's all too reactionary. Despite what Sony thinks, we're a part of an audience meant to be entertained, not a focus group. I just fail to believe that Tom Holland's Spider-Man will be integrated into SPUMC in a cohesive way that gives payoff for all of the setup that we've gotten. Not because I doubt Kelly Marcel or the team behind Kraven and the now multiversal Spider-Man 4 movie, but because I just truly don't believe that they were ever given a fighting chance. Say what you will about the Fox films, or the MCU, or the Mark Webb movies, or the fucking Wesley Snipes' Blade, or the first 2 Fantastic Four movies. At least those had a vision, sometimes, but these films are not made to last the test of time or to leave a lasting legacy on their respective characters, but to specifically cash in during temporary waves of hype into a specific series of films, complete with the most corporate fan service ever. It's bizarre. These were seemingly made as a safety net for Sony's investment in the MCU, all the way back to a cameo that Tom Holland shot for Venom 1 that was eventually cut. Probably because Kevin Feige said, "Take that shit the fuck out right now." This series is just another move in Sony's game of solitaire with the Spider-Man IP, and right now, they're beating their own ass. Venom 3 does look promising. Maybe it'll finally fix some of the issues that we've seen, and part of me does hope that the lessons of Morbius and Madam Web will change the trajectory of this universe in the way that it's being handled by the higher-ups. But at the end of the day, to Sony, its contents don't really matter. just as long as you watch.
Come on, who's your daddy?
You are. Beat the villains, control them, and make them fight for you. Spider-Man, friend or foe, you won't believe who's on your side. Rated everyone 10 and up.